I never thought I'd look back on that night and wish I'd never taken the job. It was supposed to be simple. A bodyguard gig for an up-and-coming rapper. Watch his back, make sure he stayed safe, and keep my distance from the industry vultures who circled the fresh meat. But nothing in my years of experience prepared me for what I saw, what I experienced, what followed me home. When Sean Diddy Combs' white parties became the subject of federal charges, racketeering, sex trafficking, coercion, it was like watching the world catch up to something I had known for years. But no one else knew what I knew. No one had been where I had been that night. They hadn't seen the regular. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a lifeline. After college football didn't pan out, too many injuries, too much competition, I'd spent years bouncing between jobs, trying to figure out who I was without the sport. Security work wasn't my dream, but Corey had always told me I had the build and the discipline for it. And after months of unemployment, I wasn't in a position to be picky. The client's name was Wayne, or at least that's what I'll call him. For reasons that will become painfully clear, I can't use his real name. Even now, years later, there are people who would do anything to make sure certain secrets stay buried. People who wouldn't hesitate to make him disappear if they thought he was a threat. Wayne was young, barely out of his teens, with the kind of raw talent and charisma that made people want to believe in him. When I met him for the first time, he was standing in the lobby of a recording studio, his energy buzzing like an exposed wire. He looked up as I approached, his face lighting up when he realized who I was. "You the guy?" he asked, his voice quick and eager. "Yeah," I said simply, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm here to keep an eye on you, that's it." "Cool, cool," he said, nodding as if to himself. "Just, don't be weird about it." I didn't answer. Corey had made it clear this wasn't about bonding or building trust. My job was to be the shadow behind him, silent and vigilant. I wasn't supposed to ask questions, and I wasn't supposed to get involved. The job seemed straightforward enough, but that changed when Wayne waved the envelope in my face, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "Check this out," he said. "I got invited to the white party, Diddy's white party. You know what that means?" I nodded. I knew exactly what it meant. For someone like Wayne, it was a golden ticket, a chance to network with the biggest names in the industry, to rub elbows with the kind of people who could turn a career from promising to unstoppable. For me, it meant trouble. I'd heard enough stories about those parties to know they weren't all champagne and celebrity selfies, but Wayne was determined, and it wasn't my place to question him. My job was to watch his back, not his decisions. On the night of the party, I picked him up from his studio. He was dressed to impress, his white suit perfectly tailored, his confidence radiating like heat. "You ready for this?" he asked as we climbed into the car. "Doesn't matter if I am," I said. "I'm not the one trying to make a name for myself." Wayne laughed, but I could tell he was nervous. His foot tapped against the floor as the car sped toward East Hampton, his fingers fidgeting with the cuffs of his shirt. "Just stay close, okay?" he said after a while. "These people, this scene, it's new to me." I nodded, even though he wasn't looking. "I'll be there," I said. "You just focus on doing your thing." By the time we arrived at Diddy's estate, the party was in full swing. The house was a gleaming beacon of wealth, its sprawling lawns dotted with canopies and carefully curated groups of people. A line of luxury cars snaked down the driveway, their passengers stepping out in blindingly white attire. Inside, the air was electric. The crowd buzzed with energy, their laughter and chatter weaving through the strains of live music. Wayne stuck close to me as we moved through the room, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. Then we met Diddy. He was everything I expected, charismatic, polished, and utterly in control. He greeted Wayne warmly, his smile sharp and deliberate. But when his gaze shifted to me, something flickered in his expression. Curiosity, maybe, or something darker. For a moment, I thought I saw something cold behind the charm, something calculating. "Enjoy yourselves tonight," Diddy said, his tone smooth. "Make sure you see everything there is to see." The words struck me as odd, but before I could dwell on them, Wayne was swept into another conversation. I followed, my eyes scanning the room for potential threats. What I didn't realize was that the biggest threat wasn't in plain sight. It was hidden in the shadows. The party was louder now, its energy shifting from polished sophistication to something raw and unrestrained. The music pulsed through the room like a second heartbeat, and the laughter felt sharper, more frantic, as if the guests were trying too hard to convince themselves this was all harmless fun. Wayne had settled into his element, mingling effortlessly with the crowd, his nervous energy replaced by the smooth confidence of someone who knew they belonged. He was good at it, better than I'd expected. I stayed close enough to keep an eye on him, but far enough to stay unnoticed. My job wasn't to hold his hand. It was to protect him if things went south, and things were starting to feel off. It began with the fragments of conversation I overheard as I moved through the room, pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. At first, it was small talk that shifted into something darker the moment I passed. "They're opening it tonight," I heard one woman say, her voice low but sharp. "Are they sure?" her companion replied, his tone tinged with unease. After last time, I paused, pretending to check my phone as I angled myself closer to the conversation. Before I could hear more, they noticed me, their expressions tightening before they melted into bright, empty smiles. The man clapped his companion on the shoulder and steered her away, their laughter forced and brittle. As the night wore on, I began to notice a pattern. Certain guests moved through the party with a purpose, their eyes flicking toward a specific side of the room. A door tucked into the corner, nearly hidden behind a heavy curtain. It didn't match the rest of the house, its plain wood frame stark against the opulence surrounding it. The first time I saw someone slip through it, I assumed they were staff. The second time, I wasn't so sure. The third time, I followed. I waited until Wayne was deep in conversation with a group of industry types, his laughter ringing out as he gestured animatedly. He didn't notice as I moved toward the door, keeping my steps measured and casual. If anyone saw me, they didn't stop me. The door opened into a narrow hallway, dimly lit and lined with heavy drapes. The music from the party faded as I moved deeper, replaced by something softer, a low hum that I couldn't quite place. It was cold here, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel small. Ahead of me, a group of guests were walking in silence, their movements deliberate. I kept my distance, staying just close enough to keep them in sight. At the end of the hallway was another door, this one guarded by two men in black suits. They didn't look like the staff I'd seen earlier. Their expressions were too blank, their posture too rigid. The group approached the guards and produced what looked like invitations, small cards embossed with a red symbol I didn't recognize. One by one, they were led inside. The last guest paused at the threshold, looking back over their shoulder as if sensing my presence. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding. When I looked again, they were gone and the door was closed. I turned back, retracing my steps to the main party. As soon as I stepped into the crowded room, the warmth and noise hit me like a wave. It was disorienting, the stark contrast between the glittering facade of the party and the cold, ominous hallway I'd just left. I found Wayne near the bar, his suit rumpled and his tie loosened. He grinned when he saw me, raising his glass in a mock toast. "You disappeared on me," he said. "Thought you weren't supposed to do that." I shrugged, had to check something out. He nodded, his attention already shifting back to the conversation he'd been having with an older man in a tailored suit. I scanned the room again, my eyes darting toward the hidden door in the corner. It was still there, and now it seemed even more out of place. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that I'd only scratched the surface of whatever was happening here. The whispers I'd heard earlier began to echo in my mind. They're opening it tonight. I didn't know what it was, but I had a sinking feeling I didn't want to find out. The door was already closing when I slipped back into the dimly lit hallway. My steps were soundless, my body tense with adrenaline. I moved quickly but carefully, keeping to the shadows as I followed the faint sound of footsteps ahead. The man leading Wayne hadn't noticed me, or if he had, he didn't care. The air grew colder as I descended a narrow staircase at the end of the hall. The low hum I'd heard earlier was louder now, resonating through the walls like a living pulse. At the bottom of the staircase was another door, this one heavier, made of dark wood with the same strange red symbol carved into its surface. I paused, listening. Beyond the door, I could hear faint voices, low and rhythmic, like a chant. My stomach churned as I reached for the door handle, hesitating for just a moment before pushing it open. The room was vast, cavernous, and alive with an eerie energy. The walls were covered in jagged symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim, flickering light. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, mingled with something metallic and unmistakable: blood. At the center of the room was a stone altar, its surface dark with stains, surrounded by a circle of masked figures in white robes. Wayne stood at the edge of the circle, looking visibly uncomfortable as he glanced around. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made him look small and vulnerable under the dim, pulsating light. He didn't seem to notice the chalice being filled with a dark, viscous liquid at the altar, or the way the shadows on the walls twisted and writhed like living things. Then I saw him. Diddy raised his arms, his palms slick with the same dark oil that coated his body. The symbols painted on his skin seemed to glow faintly, pulsating in time with the low hum that filled the room. He stepped closer to Wayne, his movements slow and deliberate, the air around him charged with an unnatural energy. "This is the vessel," Diddy intoned, his voice deeper now, almost inhuman. "Through his body, we summon the architect." Wayne's breathing quickened, his chest heaving as he glanced around the circle, his eyes darting from face to face in desperation. The masked figures remained silent, their arms raised as the symbols on the walls began to pulse brighter, their glow casting long, flickering shadows. Diddy reached out, placing his hand on Wayne's chest. Wayne flinched but didn't move, his body trembling under the weight of whatever force was building in the room. Diddy's hand slid down to his abdomen, tracing one of the symbols painted there with his fingers. "Through flesh," Diddy continued, his voice a low growl now. "Through pain, through surrender, the architect comes." Wayne cried out as Diddy pressed both hands firmly against his body. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, and the chanting reached a fever pitch, the voices of the masked figures blending into one hypnotic, resonant hum. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me like a physical weight, and the metallic scent of blood grew stronger. Then it began. Wayne's body jerked violently, his back arching as he let out a guttural scream. His skin seemed to ripple, as if something beneath the surface was trying to break free. The shadows on the walls twisted and coiled, forming shapes that resembled human faces, anguished, screaming faces that seemed to writhe in silent agony. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied, as Wayne's body convulsed. Dark tendrils of shadow began to seep from his skin, curling and twisting as they rose into the air. His screams became choked sobs, his body trembling as the shadows coalesced into a single massive form. It was the architect. The figure loomed over the altar, its body a swirling mass of darkness that shifted and writhed like living smoke. Its eyes burned red, twin points of light that seemed to pierce straight through me. It wasn't just looking at me. It was inside my mind, its presence crawling through my thoughts like a parasite. Wayne collapsed to the ground, his body limp and lifeless as the architect solidified, its form towering over the room. Diddy stepped back, his head bowed as the massive figure turned its gaze toward him. The masked figures dropped to their knees, their heads bowed in unison as if in worship. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The architect's gaze swept over the room, its red eyes burning with an intensity that felt like fire against my skin. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my body refused to obey. Then, slowly, the architect turned its gaze toward me. Its eyes burned into me, twin points of fire that seared through my thoughts. The architect wasn't just looking at me. It was inside me, crawling through every corner of my mind, dragging up memories I'd buried and fears I didn't even know I had. My knees buckled, and for a moment, I thought I might fall. Then I heard Wayne, a weak, choked sound, barely a whisper. I turned to see him lying on the cold stone floor, his body trembling, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. He was alive, but just barely. The architect shifted, its massive form twisting like smoke as it loomed over Wayne. The chanting from the masked figures swelled, growing louder and more fevered as they raised their arms in unison. The room vibrated with an unnatural energy, the walls seeming to pulse in time with the rhythm. I forced myself to move, crawling toward Wayne. He turned his head weakly, his glassy eyes meeting mine. For a brief moment, I thought I could save him. But then Wayne's body jerked violently, his back arching as he let out a strangled scream. His skin rippled as if something beneath the surface was trying to break free. The architect's shadow wrapped around him, tendrils of darkness sinking into his skin, consuming him piece by piece. The chanting reached a crescendo, the voices of the masked figures blending into one unified, deafening note. The glow from the symbols on the walls grew brighter, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across Wayne's convulsing body. I froze, unable to look away as Wayne's form twisted and contorted. His face stretched into a silent scream, his features melting into the shifting shadows that enveloped him. His body became a vessel, no longer human, no longer Wayne. The architect rose, fully formed now, its massive, shadowy body pulsing with malevolent energy. Its glowing red eyes burned brighter than ever, and the room fell into a stunned, reverent silence. I should have stayed. I should have done something, anything, but I didn't. As the architect turned its gaze toward me, I felt my legs move before my brain could catch up. I scrambled to my feet, my chest tight with panic, as I stumbled toward the door. No one stopped me. The masked figures remained on their knees, their heads bowed in worshipful submission. Even Diddy, still slick with that dark, glistening oil, stood frozen at the altar, his arms raised in supplication. All eyes were on the architect, their awe so complete, they didn't even register my escape. I pushed through the heavy door, the cold air of the hallway hitting me like a slap to the face. My legs burned as I climbed the narrow staircase, every step feeling like it stretched forever. Behind me, the low hum of the architect's presence seemed to grow louder, an oppressive force that pressed against my back, urging me to run faster. When I burst through the door at the top of the staircase, the warmth and noise of the party hit me like a wall. The music, the laughter, the clinking glasses, it all felt so wrong, so detached from the nightmare I had just witnessed. No one noticed me at first. The guests were too busy drinking, laughing, posing for selfies, their polished smiles hiding whatever darkness they'd chosen to ignore. But as I pushed through the crowd, I saw them turn, one by one, their laughter fading as they watched me. Their expressions weren't shocked or angry. They were curious, almost detached. They knew. Somehow they all knew what was happening below, and none of them cared. I didn't stop. My eyes locked on the exit, the cool night air beyond the doors promising escape. I shoved past a server, knocking his tray of champagne to the ground. He didn't say a word, his blank face turning to follow me as I ran. When I reached the doors, I didn't hesitate. I threw them open and stumbled outside, the cold air filling my lungs like a lifeline. The mansion loomed behind me, its glowing windows like eyes watching my every move. The black SUV was still parked near the entrance, its driver leaning against the hood with a cigarette dangling from his lips. He looked up as I approached, his expression shifting from boredom to mild alarm. "You good?" he asked, straightening as I ran toward him. "Drive," I gasped, my voice raw. "What about your—" "Just drive," I shouted, my voice breaking. He nodded quickly, tossing the cigarette to the ground and climbing into the driver's seat. I threw myself into the back, slamming the door shut behind me. The SUV roared to life, the tires screeching against the pavement as we sped down the long driveway. The turn. I leaned back in the seat, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. My hands trembled, my body still buzzing with adrenaline. As the mansion faded into the distance, I felt the first flicker of relief, but it didn't last. Something told me to look back, and against my better judgment, I turned. In the rearview mirror, I saw the mansion's glowing windows shrinking in the distance. But just beyond them, barely visible against the darkness, I saw it, the massive shadowy form of the architect. Its red eyes burned like twin beacons, cutting through the night with an intensity that made my stomach churn. And then I saw him, Wayne. He stood at the edge of the driveway, his naked body covered in those jagged symbols, his skin darkened and twisted by the architect's shadow. His face was blank, his eyes hollow and glowing faintly red. But he was looking straight at me. My breath caught in my throat as I stared back at him, my mind reeling. That wasn't Wayne anymore. Not the Wayne I knew. The architect had taken him, consumed him, turned him into something else, something not human. Faster, I croaked, my voice barely audible. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his brows furrowing. "What? Just go," I shouted, my voice breaking. He hit the gas, the engine roaring as we sped down the winding road. But even as we raced farther and farther away, I couldn't shake the image of Wayne from my mind. You're probably wondering why I've been calling him Wayne, why I've gone to such lengths to hide his identity, to keep him anonymous. It's not just to protect him, it's to protect me. Because this story, the real version, the version I just told you, isn't the kind of thing people believe. It's too insane, too horrifying. You'll call me paranoid. You'll say I've lost my mind, and maybe you're right. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. And if I gave you his real name, if I let you dig into who he was and what he became, someone would come for me. They'd silence me, just like they've silenced everyone else who got too close to the truth. So I'll call him Wayne, and I'll keep running, because the architect is still out there. And one day, it's going to find me. The mansion is gone. The party is over. Wayne is no longer Wayne. But the Red Room isn't gone. It lives in my mind, festering like a wound that won't heal. Every time I close my eyes, I see it. I smell the blood, the incense, the suffocating weight of that ritual. The walls were alive, covered in those glowing, jagged symbols that pulsed with a rhythm I can still feel in my chest. The chanting echoes in my ears sometimes, soft and distant, like a memory that refuses to fade. The architect came from that room, and now it's a part of me, a stain I can't wash away. The Red Room was more than a place. It was a doorway, and even though I ran, I know it didn't close behind me. It's still open, and it's waiting.